Welcome, Night Owl. I'm genuinely glad you've chosen to spend your evening or early morning with me. Whether you're here to unwind after a long day or simply curious about the darker corners of history, tonight's tale is here to gently guide you toward rest. In a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming, there's a unique comfort in stepping back, far back into the annals of time. Tonight, we're not just recounting facts. We're delving into the human experience, exploring the profound impact of power, mental health, and the relentless march of destiny on those who wore the crown. Before we drift too far back in time, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Your engagement fuels this journey, transforming a monologue into a shared exploration. And if this calm, immersive style of storytelling speaks to you, if you find a solace or fascination in these historical deep dives, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing which part of tonight's journey resonates most. Your support allows me to continue crafting these narratives, bringing forgotten tales to light, and perhaps offering a moment of quiet reflection in your busy lives. Tonight, we embark on a voyage through the troubled reigns of some of history's most infamous medieval monarchs, rulers whose names still echo, not with triumph, but with tragedy. The medieval period, often romanticized as an era of chivalry and grand castles, was in reality a brutal crucible where power was absolute and the line between sanity and madness could blur with terrifying ease. We will explore how the immense weight of a kingdom, coupled with the insidious onset of mental turmoil, could transform kings into either cruel tyrants or fragile shadows, leaving an indelible mark on their nations and the course of history itself. Our journey begins in the heart of France, a nation grappling with the aftermath of relentless conflict, yet clinging to the hope of a new dawn. We will then traverse the channel to England, where another monarch, equally burdened by the crown, faced his own descent into a similar abyss. These are not mere historical footnotes. They are cautionary tales, human dramas played out on the grandest of stages, reminding us that even those at the pinnacle of power are ultimately vulnerable to the frailties of the human condition. We will uncover the intricate tapestry of political intrigue, societal upheaval, and personal suffering that defined these reigns, seeking to understand not just what happened, but why, and what enduring lessons they offer us today. Prepare to be transported to a time when the fate of millions rested on the stability of a single mind, and where the whispers of madness could reshape empires. This narrative aims to be more than just a historical account. It is an immersive experience designed to draw you into the lives of these complex figures. We will explore the psychological toll of leadership, the societal perceptions of mental illness in an age of superstition, and the devastating consequences when a nation's stability is tethered to the unpredictable currents of a monarch's mind. From the echoing halls of Paris to the frozen Kremlin, we'll uncover how power, when laced with mental turmoil, can transform kings into either cruel tyrants or fragile shadows. The stories we are about to unfold are not just about kings and queens. They are about humanity, its resilience, its vulnerabilities, and its enduring struggle for order amidst chaos. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let us begin our descent into the captivating and often chilling history of the Mad Monarchs. We will examine the cultural and religious contexts that shaped the understanding of mental illness in the medieval era? Was it seen as a divine punishment, a demonic possession, or simply a natural affliction? How did these beliefs influence the treatment, or lack thereof, of these troubled rulers? We will also touch upon the political ramifications of a monarch's incapacitation, exploring how regencies were formed, how power vacuums emerged, and how ambitious nobles exploited these vulnerabilities for their own gain. The 100 Years' War, a conflict that spanned generations, will serve as a grim backdrop to some of these narratives, illustrating how internal strife could exacerbate external threats, pushing nations to the brink of collapse. Furthermore, we will delve into the personal lives of these monarchs, seeking to understand the pressures they faced from childhood, the expectations placed upon them, and the isolation that often accompanied their exalted status. The weight of a crown was not merely symbolic, it was a tangible burden, a constant reminder of the immense responsibility to God and to their people. How did this burden contribute to their mental decline? Were there moments of lucidity, of desperate struggle against the encroaching darkness? And what became of those who loved them, who witnessed their transformation from beloved leaders to figures of pity or fear? These are the questions we will explore, seeking to paint a comprehensive and empathetic portrait of these historical figures. Our journey will be guided by historical accounts, chronicles, and scholarly interpretations, piecing together a narrative that is both accurate and compelling. While the exact medical diagnoses of the past remain speculative, we can infer much from the detailed descriptions left by contemporary observers. We will strive to present these stories with sensitivity, acknowledging the profound suffering experienced by these individuals, while also highlighting the broader historical impact of their conditions. This is a story of power, madness, and the enduring human spirit, a tale that transcends the centuries and offers a poignant reflection on the complexities of leadership and the fragility of the mind. So, once again, welcome and prepare to be captivated by the tragic sagas of the Mad Monarchs. France, in the late 14th century, stood at a crossroads, a nation scarred by the relentless brutality of the 100 Years' War, yet clinging to the fragile threads of hope for a brighter future. The Black Death had swept through Europe just decades prior, decimating populations and shattering the social fabric. Famine and peasant revolts, like the Jacquerie, had further destabilized the kingdom, leaving a populace weary of conflict and yearning for stability. It was into this landscape of profound uncertainty and simmering discontent that Charles VI, a mere boy of 11, stepped onto the grand yet precarious stage of French monarchy. His ascension followed the death of his father, Charles V, a monarch known as the Wise for his astute governance and efforts to rebuild France after earlier defeats. The weight of expectation on young Charles VI was immense, a burden few adults could bear, let alone a child. Crowned at Reims on November 4th, 1380, Charles VI was initially seen as a beacon of renewed hope. Unlike his more reserved and scholarly father, Charles V, the young king possessed a natural charisma and an engaging personality that immediately endeared him to his subjects. He was described by chroniclers as intelligent, graceful, and possessing a gallant demeanor, qualities that quickly earned him the affectionate and optimistic title of Charles the Beloved. This moniker was not merely a formality, it reflected a genuine outpouring of public affection and a collective desire for a ruler who could embody the aspirations of a nation desperate for peace and prosperity. His youth, far from being a disadvantage, seemed to symbolize a fresh start, a break from the bitter legacies of past reigns. The early years of Charles VI's reign were marked by a regency council dominated by his powerful uncles, Louis I, Duke of Anjou, John, Duke of Berry, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and Louis II, Duke of Bourbon. These regents, while ostensibly guiding the young king, often pursued their own dynastic interests, leading to internal conflicts and further draining the royal treasury. Despite this turbulent political environment, Charles himself, as he matured into adolescence, began to display qualities that reinforced the public's initial optimism. He was known for his love of tournaments, grand feasts, and courtly entertainment, activities that projected an image of a vibrant and confident monarchy. He enjoyed music, patronized the arts, and participated enthusiastically in the chivalric rituals of the age, all of which contributed to his popular image as a true knight king. His youthful enthusiasm brought a much-needed energy to a court that had grown fatigued by decades of conflict and political maneuvering. Under his seemingly benevolent gaze, the kingdom appeared to breathe easier. There was a sense that the long night of war and suffering might finally be drawing to a close, and that Charles VI, with his charm and apparent vigor, was the monarch destined to lead France into a new era of peace and stability. He was seen as a unifying figure, capable of bridging the divides that had plagued the French nobility and of restoring the prestige of the Valois dynasty. The early years of his personal rule, which began in 1388 when he dismissed his uncles from the regency, were particularly promising. He surrounded himself with a new generation of advisors, known as the marmousets, who were largely drawn from the lesser nobility and aimed to implement reforms and restore royal authority. During this period, Charles VI actively engaged in governance, demonstrating a keen interest in justice and the welfare of his subjects. He undertook military campaigns, including an expedition to Brittany and a planned invasion of England, which, though ultimately unsuccessful, showcased his determination and martial spirit. He also sought to address the grievances of the common people, issuing ordinances aimed at curbing corruption and improving administration. These actions further solidified his image as a conscientious and capable ruler, a king who genuinely cared for his kingdom. The future of France, it seemed, was in capable hands, guided by a monarch who embodied the very best of chivalric ideals and enlightened leadership. The chronicles of the time speak of a king who was accessible, who listened to his advisors, and who was committed to the arduous task of rebuilding a fractured nation. However, beneath this veneer of promise and popularity, the seeds of tragedy were already being sown. The immense pressures of kingship, the constant demands of governance, the intricate web of political alliances and rivalries, and the ever-present threat of war, all weighed heavily on the young monarch. While outwardly robust and charismatic, the internal strain of his position, coupled with a potential genetic predisposition to mental illness, would soon begin to manifest in ways that would shatter the hopes of his people and plunge France into an even deeper abyss of chaos. The contrast between the bright promise of his early reign and the dark reality that was to follow makes his story all the more poignant and serves as a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of fate, even for those born to wear a crown. The medieval understanding of mental health was, of course, vastly different from our own. Afflictions of the mind were often attributed to supernatural causes, demonic possession, divine punishment, or the influence of malevolent spirits. There was little medical understanding of psychological disorders, and treatments, if any, were often rooted in superstition or religious ritual. This lack of comprehension would only exacerbate Charles VI's suffering and the kingdom's inability to cope with his deteriorating condition. The initial signs of his illness were subtle, perhaps dismissed as eccentricities or the stresses of leadership, but as they escalated, they would transform the beloved king into a figure of fear and pity, a living symbol of France's unraveling. His court, once vibrant and full of life, would become a place of hushed whispers and anxious glances as courtiers struggled to navigate the unpredictable moods of their sovereign. The transition from Charles the Beloved to Charles the Mad was not instantaneous, but a gradual, agonizing descent, marked by a series of increasingly bizarre and alarming episodes. Each incident chipped away at the image of the strong, capable monarch, replacing it with a terrifying portrait of a mind unhinged. The stage was set for a tragedy of epic proportions, one that would not only define Charles the Stubborner's legacy, but also profoundly alter the course of French history, leaving a legacy of civil war, foreign invasion, and profound national trauma. The promise of a young king, once so bright, was about to be extinguished by the encroaching darkness of madness. But fate, as it often does in the grand narratives of history, can be exquisitely cruel, weaving threads of seemingly innocuous events into a tapestry of profound tragedy. For Charles VI, the turning point, the dramatic catalyst that seemingly propelled him from the precipice into the abyss of madness, arrived on the night of January 28th, 1393. This was the night of the infamous Bal des Ardentes, or Ball of the Burning Men, a masquerade held in the Hôtel de Saint-Paul in Paris in celebration of the third marriage of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabeau Catherine de Fin to the Lord of Aymery de Giac. What began as a festive diversion, a moment of light-hearted revelry in a court often burdened by the weight of state, quickly devolved into a horrifying spectacle that would forever sear itself into the collective memory of France, and more critically, into the fragile psyche of its young king. The concept of the masquerade itself was not unusual for the time. Medieval courts, despite their rigid hierarchies and serious political machinations, also indulged in elaborate entertainments, pageants, and charades. These events served not only as amusement, but also as displays of wealth, power, and courtly sophistication. The theme chosen for this particular masquerade was that of wild men, or savages, hommes sauvages, a popular motif in medieval folklore and art, often depicted as mythical beings, covered in hair or leaves, living outside the bounds of civilized society. For the Bal des Ardentes, Charles and 5 of his companions, including his brother-in-law, Huguet de Guise, decided to embody these figures in a particularly dangerous manner. Their costumes were crafted from linen, meticulously sewn onto their bodies, and then coated with a highly flammable mixture of pitch, resin, and wax. To complete the illusion of wildness, flax, a fibrous plant material, was attached to the sticky surface, giving them a shaggy, beastly appearance. Their faces were masked, further obscuring their identities and adding to the mystique of the performance. The plan was for these 6 wild men to enter the hall, chained together, and perform a dance, a spectacle that was meant to be both amusing and slightly daring. The atmosphere in the hall was one of excited anticipation, with the cream of French nobility gathered, eager for a diversion from the political tensions and the lingering shadows of war. However, the inherent danger of such costumes, especially in an era lit primarily by open flames, was tragically underestimated. The Duke of Orleans, Charles's younger brother, arrived late to the festivities, reportedly having been out carousing. Drunk and curious, he approached the dancing figures, holding a torch aloft, either to get a better look at their disguised faces, or, as some accounts suggest, to identify them. As the torchlight flickered over the pitch and flax-covered dancers, tragedy struck with terrifying swiftness. A single spark, a momentary lapse in judgment, was all it took. In seconds, the highly flammable costumes ignited, transforming the 6 men into living torches. The hall, moments before, filled with laughter and music, erupted into a cacophony of screams, panic, and the horrifying smell of burning flesh. The scene was one of unimaginable chaos. The other guests, horrified, scrambled to escape the inferno, while those closest to the burning men desperately tried to extinguish the flames. 4 of Charles's companions, including Hugues de Guise, were not so fortunate. Their screams echoed through the hall as they perished in agony, their lives consumed by the very spectacle they had intended to create. The horror of their deaths, witnessed by the entire court, was a stark and brutal reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of fate, even for those within the gilded cages of royalty. Charles VI, however, was miraculously saved, though not without severe psychological scarring. His aunt, the quick-thinking and courageous Duchess of Berry, Jeanne de Boulogne, recognized the king despite his disguise. In a desperate act of heroism, she threw her heavy, voluminous robe over him, smothering the flames and shielding him from the inferno. Her swift action undoubtedly saved his life, but the trauma of the event, the screams of his burning companions, the smell of their immolation, and the sheer terror of his own near-death experience seared itself into the king's mind. It was a moment of profound psychological shock, a brutal awakening to the precariousness of his existence and the arbitrary nature of disaster. The Bal des Ardents was not merely an unfortunate accident. It was a pivotal moment in Charles VI's life and reign. While he had experienced previous, milder episodes of mental instability, often attributed to fevers or stress, this event marked a dramatic and irreversible shift. The chroniclers of the time, such as Jean Froissart and the monk of Saint-Denis, meticulously documented the horror of the ball and its immediate aftermath, noting the profound impact it had on the king. The public reaction was one of shock and outrage. The masquerade, seen as an act of frivolity and excess, was widely condemned as impious and a direct cause of divine displeasure. Many viewed the tragedy as a sign of God's wrath, a punishment for the moral laxity of the court and, by extension, the kingdom. For Charles, the psychological fallout was immediate and severe. The incident seemed to trigger a rapid and dramatic deterioration of his mental state. The terrifying images of his friends burning alive, the feeling of the flames licking at his own body, and the sheer helplessness of the situation plunged him into a deep and lasting psychological crisis. It was as if the fire had not only consumed his companions, but had also ignited a destructive force within his own mind, burning away the last vestiges of his sanity. The carefree, beloved king, once so full of promise, began his agonizing descent into what would become known as his madness, a condition that would plague him for the remainder of his life and cast a long dark shadow over the future of France. The event also had significant political repercussions. The Duke of Orleans, whose careless actions had caused the fire, faced public condemnation, further exacerbating the already strained relationship between the royal family and the powerful ducal factions. The vulnerability of the king, so starkly exposed by the incident, became a source of deep concern and political maneuvering. The Regency Council, which Charles had dismissed, now seemed a more appealing option to some, given the king's apparent instability. The Bal des Ardents, therefore, was not just a personal tragedy for Charles VI. It was a national trauma, a public spectacle that underscored the fragility of the monarchy and foreshadowed the turbulent decades that lay ahead for France. It was the night the beloved king began to burn, not just outwardly, but from within, a fire that would consume his mind and, in turn, threaten to engulf his entire kingdom. Following the harrowing trauma of the Bal des Ardents, the subtle eccentricities that had occasionally surfaced in Charles VI's behavior rapidly escalated into a full-blown and terrifying descent into madness. The incident, a public spectacle of horror and near-death experience, acted as a brutal trigger, shattering the fragile equilibrium of his mind. What began as whispers of odd behavior soon became undeniable, alarming manifestations of a profound psychological break that would plague him for the remaining 3 decades of his life, earning him the tragic moniker of Charles the Mad. Charles Le Fou. His condition was not a constant state of delirium. Rather, it was characterized by periods of intense psychosis, interspersed with moments of terrifying lucidity, creating an unpredictable and deeply distressing environment for those around him. One of the most striking and frequently recounted symptoms of Charles S. madness was his profound amnesia and disorientation. He forgot his own name, a fundamental aspect of identity, and failed to recognize his closest family members, his beloved queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, and his own children. Imagine the terror and confusion of a monarch, the very embodiment of his nation, waking each day without the most basic understanding of who he was or his place in the world. This loss of self was often accompanied by a terrifying delusion. He believed he was made of glass, a delusion known as glass delusion or vitreous delusion. This particular affliction, though rare, has been documented in other historical figures and involves the irrational belief that one's body is made of glass and is therefore extremely fragile and susceptible to shattering. Charles was terrified that the slightest touch would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces, leading him to avoid physical contact and to wrap himself in protective layers, further isolating him from human connection. His behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He would often dash screaming through the palace halls, convinced that enemies were pursuing him, or that he was being hunted by invisible forces. These episodes of paranoia and terror were not confined to the privacy of his chambers. They were public displays that shocked and frightened his court. At times, he would refuse to bathe or wear clean clothes, his once regal robes becoming tattered, vermin-infested rags. The stench emanating from him became unbearable, a stark contrast to the perfumed elegance expected of a king. This self-neglect was a clear sign of his detachment from reality and his inability to maintain even the most basic personal hygiene, further cementing the perception of his madness. Courtiers, physicians, and religious figures alike struggled to comprehend his condition. In an age steeped in superstition and religious dogma, explanations for such profound mental illness often veered towards the supernatural. Whispers of curses, demonic possession, or divine punishment circulated through the court and beyond. Some believed he was afflicted by sorcery, perhaps by his enemies, or by those within his own court seeking to gain power. Exorcisms were attempted, and various religious rituals were performed in a desperate effort to drive out the perceived evil spirits tormenting the king. However, these interventions proved futile, as the root of his suffering lay not in the spiritual realm, but in the complex and then ununderstood workings of the human brain. While contemporary understanding was limited, modern historians and medical professionals, looking back at the detailed accounts of his symptoms, have speculated on potential diagnoses. The pattern of his illness, periods of acute psychosis, delusions like the glass delusion, paranoia, disorganization of thought, and emotional blunting, strongly suggests what we might now call schizophrenia, or a severe form of bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The cyclical nature of his madness, with periods of remission and relapse, is also consistent with these conditions. The stress of his position, the trauma of the Bal des Ardents, and potentially a genetic predisposition could all have contributed to the onset and progression of his illness. It was a severe psychological break, a catastrophic unraveling of his mental faculties that left him largely incapacitated. The impact of his illness extended beyond his personal suffering. His unpredictable behavior made governance impossible. During his periods of lucidity, he would attempt to rule, only to relapse, throwing the kingdom into disarray once more. The court became a chaotic environment, with factions vying for control, exploiting the king's vulnerability for their own political gain. His illness created a power vacuum that his ambitious relatives, particularly his brother Louis of Orléans and his uncle Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, were all too eager to fill. This internal strife, fueled by the king's incapacitation, would eventually plunge France into a devastating civil war known as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, further weakening the nation and making it ripe for foreign invasion. The public, initially sympathetic to their beloved king, grew increasingly bewildered and fearful. The sight of their monarch, once a symbol of strength and stability, reduced to a screaming, disheveled figure, was deeply unsettling. It challenged the very notion of divine right and the stability of the monarchy. The chroniclers of the time, while often attributing his madness to divine displeasure, also expressed a profound sense of pity for the king, recognizing the immense suffering he endured. The monk of Saint-Denis, a contemporary chronicler, provided vivid and often heartbreaking accounts of Charles's episodes, detailing his delusions and the desperate attempts of his attendants to manage his unpredictable behavior. One particularly poignant account describes how, during one of his fits, Charles would tear off his clothes and run wildly through the palace, forcing his servants to chase him and restrain him. On another occasion, he refused to allow anyone to touch him, fearing he would shatter, and had to be forcibly dressed and moved. These episodes were not isolated incidents, but became a recurring nightmare for the court, forcing them to adapt to the unpredictable rhythms of the king's madness. Special measures were put in place to manage him, including the appointment of a team of attendants whose sole responsibility was to care for the king and try to anticipate his next erratic move. Yet, despite these efforts, the shadow of his illness loomed large over the entire kingdom, a constant reminder of the fragility of power and the devastating consequences of a mind unhinged. The descent into madness was a slow, agonizing process, but the Bal des Ardents served as the undeniable point of no return. From that night forward, Charles VI was no longer the promising young king, but a tragic figure, a prisoner within his own mind, whose personal torment would reverberate throughout his kingdom, leaving a legacy of chaos, civil war, and national trauma. His story stands as a stark historical testament to the devastating impact of mental illness, particularly when it afflicts those at the very pinnacle of power, whose personal suffering can so profoundly shape the destiny of nations. As Charles VI's condition worsened, plunging him deeper into the labyrinth of his own mind, the governance of France became a dangerous and increasingly chaotic game of shadows. The king, once the central pillar of authority and the embodiment of the state, was now a volatile, unpredictable figure, capable of lucid moments, followed by terrifying descents into delusion. This created an unprecedented power vacuum at the very heart of the kingdom, a void that ambitious and powerful, noble factions were all too eager to fill. The delicate balance of power, which had always been a precarious dance between the crown and the great feudal lords, now tipped precariously, threatening to unravel the very fabric of the French state. The most prominent and destructive rivalry emerged between Charles VI's younger brother, Louis of Orleans, and his powerful uncle, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Philip, the youngest son of King John II of France, had been granted the Duchy of Burgundy in 1363 and had, through strategic marriages and shrewd political maneuvering, built a vast and wealthy domain that rivaled the king's own. Louis of Orleans, on the other hand, was the king's closest male relative and, in the absence of a stable monarch, saw himself as the natural heir to influence and power. Both men were ambitious, ruthless, and possessed significant military and financial resources. Their personal animosity, fueled by a desire for control over the incapacitated king and the royal treasury, quickly escalated into a bitter and devastating struggle for supremacy. This rivalry was not merely a personal feud. It was a struggle for the soul of France. The Burgundian faction, led by Philip and later his son John the Fearless, advocated for a more centralized, authoritarian monarchy, often aligning themselves with the urban bourgeoisie and seeking to control the royal administration. The Orleanist faction, later known as the Armagnacs, after Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, who became a prominent leader, represented the interests of the older feudal nobility and sought to maintain their traditional autonomy. Their conflict manifested in various ways: propaganda campaigns, economic blockades, and increasingly open warfare. Paris, the capital, became a battleground, its streets frequently witnessing skirmishes and assassinations as the two factions vied for control of the King A.S. person and the levers of government. The consequences of this internal strife were catastrophic for France. The Civil War, known as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, plunged the nation into a period of unprecedented chaos and suffering. Cities were besieged, lands were ravaged, and the common people, already burdened by war and disease, found themselves caught between the warring factions. The royal treasury, already depleted by the 100 Years' War, was further drained by the constant military expenditures and the rampant corruption that flourished in the absence of strong central authority. Taxes increased, but the revenue often disappeared into the pockets of opportunistic nobles rather than being used for the common good. Justice became arbitrary, and lawlessness spread as local lords took advantage of the power vacuum to pursue their own agendas, often at the expense of their subjects. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, France's ancient enemy watched with keen interest. England, under the ambitious and militarily gifted King Henry V, saw France's internal weakness not as a tragedy, but as a golden opportunity. The 100 Years' War, which had seen periods of truce and renewed conflict since 1337, was reignited with a ferocity that would bring France to its knees. Henry V, a shrewd strategist, understood that a nation divided against itself could not stand against a unified and determined external foe. The madness of Charles VI and the subsequent Civil War provided the perfect pretext and the ideal conditions for a renewed English invasion. In 1415, Henry V launched his invasion, culminating in the decisive Battle of Agincourt. This battle, a stunning English victory against a numerically superior French army, was a direct consequence of France's internal divisions. Many of the most powerful French nobles, including key figures from both the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, were either killed or captured, further decapitating the French leadership and deepening the political crisis. The defeat at Agincourt was not just a military setback, it was a psychological blow that shattered French morale and exposed the full extent of their vulnerability. Following Agincourt, Henry V systematically conquered large swathes of northern France, including Normandy. The French court, desperate and fractured, was unable to mount an effective resistance. The ultimate humiliation came in 1420 with the signing of the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty, a direct result of Charles VI's incapacitation and the Burgundian faction's desire to end the Civil War, was a devastating blow to French sovereignty. It stipulated that Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, would marry Henry V's, and that their son would inherit the French throne upon Charles VI's death, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, and uniting the crowns of England and France under an English monarch. The treaty was a testament to how profoundly the king's madness had impacted the destiny of his nation, allowing a foreign power to dictate the terms of its succession. The signing of the Treaty of Troyes was a moment of profound national shame and despair for many French loyalists. It meant that the legitimate heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Charles, was effectively disinherited, and the future of France lay in the hands of its long-standing enemy. The Burgundians, who had allied with the English, saw this as a way to secure their own power and end the civil war. But for the Armagnacs and other loyalists, it was an unforgivable betrayal. The country was now not only embroiled in a civil war, but also under foreign occupation, with a mad king as its nominal head. The suffering of the French people was compounded by the absence of a guiding hand at the helm. With the king incapacitated and his relatives consumed by their own power struggles, there was no consistent, unified leadership to address the myriad problems facing the kingdom. The judicial system faltered, trade routes were disrupted, and the economy stagnated. The peasantry, already living on the brink of subsistence, faced increased demands for taxes and levies from multiple, often conflicting authorities. Villages were plundered by roving bands of soldiers, both French and English, and the social order began to break down. The once proud kingdom of France, a beacon of medieval power, was teetering on the brink of collapse, its fate hanging by a thread, largely due to the tragic mental decline of its monarch. The impact of Charles VI's madness on France cannot be overstated. It was not merely a personal tragedy for the king. It was a national catastrophe that reshaped the political landscape of Europe. It led directly to the intensification of the 100 Years' War, the devastating Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, and the humiliating Treaty of Troyes, which threatened to extinguish French independence. The king's illness created a void that allowed ambition, greed, and foreign aggression to flourish, pushing France to the very edge of annihilation. It was a stark demonstration of how the personal frailties of a ruler, particularly in an age of absolute monarchy, could have profound and devastating consequences for an entire nation, leaving a legacy of division, destruction, and despair that would take generations to overcome. With Charles II's mind adrift in a sea of delusion, and his physical presence a mere shadow of his former self, the French court, once a vibrant center of power and culture, devolved into a treacherous battlefield. It was a stage where loyalists, opportunists, and foreign agents moved with calculated precision, each seeking to influence royal decisions, often in the king's name, but rarely, if ever, for the genuine good of the kingdom. The absence of a stable, authoritative monarch created a vacuum that drew in all manner of ambitious figures, transforming the machinery of government into a chaotic free-for-all. The concept of a unified, divinely ordained monarchy, so central to medieval political thought, began to crumble under the weight of the king's incapacitation. The regency, initially established to govern during Charles's minority, was now a permanent yet unstable fixture. His uncles and brother, particularly Louis of Orleans and the Dukes of Burgundy, engaged in a relentless struggle for control. This was not a struggle for the betterment of France, but for personal enrichment, territorial expansion, and dynastic prestige. They manipulated the king's periods of lucidity, attempting to extract decrees and appointments that favored their factions, only to see these decisions overturned or ignored during his next bout of madness. The Royal Council, meant to advise the king and administer the realm, became a revolving door of partisan appointments, its decisions often contradictory, and its authority undermined by the constant infighting. Regional governors, sensing the weakness at the center, seized autonomy with increasing boldness. They began to act as independent potentates, raising their own armies, levying their own taxes, and forming alliances that often ran counter to the interests of the crown. The traditional feudal structure, which relied on a strong monarch to enforce loyalty and maintain order, began to fray. Local disputes escalated into full-blown conflicts as dukes and counts settled old scores without fear of royal reprisal. The concept of a unified French nation, painstakingly built over centuries, was now threatened by a resurgence of regionalism and a fragmentation of power. Tax collection, the lifeblood of any functioning state, faltered dramatically. The royal treasury, already strained by the ongoing war with England and the lavish expenditures of the court, now faced widespread evasion and outright theft. Nobles diverted royal revenues into their own coffers, while the common people, suffering under the weight of multiple, often arbitrary levies, became increasingly resistant to paying taxes that seemed to disappear without benefiting them. The financial instability further crippled the kingdom's ability to wage war, maintain order, or provide for its populace. The once efficient royal administration, which had been a hallmark of Charles V's reign, became riddled with corruption and inefficiency, unable to enforce its will or collect the necessary resources to govern effectively. The peasantry, the vast majority of the population, bore the brunt of this rising instability, already ravaged by the Black Death, famine, and the depredations of war. They now faced the added burden of a fractured and predatory government. Their crops were seized by warring factions. Their homes were plundered by soldiers, and their lives were constantly at risk from the lawlessness that spread across the countryside. The social contract, the implicit agreement between ruler and ruled, was broken. The king, meant to be their protector and provider of justice, was now a distant, incomprehensible figure, and his government offered little in the way of relief or security. The suffering of the common people was immense, a silent testament to the chaos unleashed by the king's illness. In the eyes of many, France was becoming ungovernable. The symbolic center, the king, had become unreliable, a source of instability rather than strength. In a world where royal authority was seen as divinely ordained, Charles's madness seemed like a punishment from heaven, a divine crisis made mortal. This perception was deeply unsettling. If God had abandoned their king, what did that mean for France? Was it a sign of collective sin, a prelude to the end times? Such questions fueled widespread anxiety and despair, undermining faith in the monarchy and the established order. The Church, a powerful force in medieval society, struggled to provide answers, often resorting to prayers and rituals that offered little practical solution to the kingdom's woes. The political landscape was further complicated by the presence of foreign powers. England, as previously discussed, exploited France's internal divisions to renew its claims to the French throne. But other European powers also watched with interest, some seeking to gain influence, others to protect their own interests in a destabilized region. The Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and various Italian city-states all had a stake in the outcome of the French crisis, adding another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of alliances and rivalries. The French court, instead of presenting a united front to these external pressures, was consumed by its own internal squabbles, making it an easy target for manipulation and exploitation. The chroniclers of the time, such as Jean Juvenal des Ursins and the monk of Saint-Denis, provide vivid and often despairing accounts of this period. They describe a kingdom adrift, its people suffering, and its leaders consumed by petty rivalries. The monk of Saint-Denis, in particular, lamented the state of France, seeing the king's madness as a direct cause of the nation's misfortunes. He wrote of the constant fear, the breakdown of justice, and the widespread misery that afflicted the land. His chronicles serve as a powerful contemporary witness to the devastating impact of Charles VI's illness on the entire kingdom. Moreover, the king's unpredictable behavior made diplomatic relations a nightmare. Treaties signed during a period of lucidity might be repudiated during a fit of madness. Ambassadors from foreign courts found themselves navigating a labyrinth of court intrigue, unsure of who truly held power or whose word could be trusted. This further isolated France on the international stage, making it difficult to forge alliances or negotiate favorable terms in the ongoing conflicts. The once proud Valois dynasty, which had commanded respect across Europe, was now seen as weak and unreliable, its future uncertain. The crisis extended beyond the political and economic spheres. It permeated the very culture of the court. The lavish entertainments and displays of wealth continued, but they were now tinged with an undercurrent of anxiety and fear. Courtiers lived in constant apprehension of the king's next outburst, and the atmosphere was one of uneasy pageantry. The arts and sciences, which had flourished under Charles V, now struggled to find patronage amidst the chaos. The intellectual life of the court, once vibrant, began to wane as survival and political maneuvering became the primary concerns. In essence, Charles VI's madness did not just affect him personally, it became a national malady. It corroded the foundations of royal authority, fueled civil war, invited foreign invasion, and plunged the French people into an era of unprecedented suffering. The kingdom was in crisis, not just from external threats, but from a profound internal decay, a decay that began with the unraveling of the king's mind. The story of Charles VI's reign is a powerful illustration of how deeply intertwined the fate of a nation can be with the mental stability of its ruler, particularly in an age when the monarch was seen as the very embodiment of the state. The echoes of this crisis would reverberate for decades, shaping the course of French history and leaving an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the nation. Yet, amidst the swirling chaos of his madness, the terrifying delusions, and the profound detachment from reality, Charles VI was not entirely lost. There were moments, fleeting and precious, when the clouds of his illness would part, revealing glimpses of the man he used to be, the intelligent, charismatic, and beloved king. These periods of lucidity, though increasingly rare as his condition progressed, were like shafts of sunlight piercing through a storm, offering a poignant reminder of the profound tragedy of his affliction and the depth of the human spirit trapped within. One such story, recounted by contemporary chroniclers, tells of a knight from Charles's youth, a companion from his early, more carefree days, who returned to court after many years away. This knight, perhaps unaware of the full extent of the king's decline, or simply hoping to reconnect with an old friend, sought an audience. He found Charles in a rare moment of clarity, his eyes clear, his demeanor calm, a stark contrast to the agitated and disoriented figure he had become. The knight approached him tenderly, perhaps with a mixture of hope and trepidation, and Charles, recognizing him, wept openly. It was a moment of profound emotional connection, a brief return to a past that seemed irrevocably lost. "You are one of my loyal friends," Charles reportedly said, his voice perhaps tinged with the sorrow of his own predicament. "Stay with me. You are most welcome." In that simple, heartfelt plea, the kind-hearted boy king, the one who had earned the affection of his people, returned. For a few fleeting minutes, the barriers of madness seemed to crumble, and the true Charles, the one buried beneath layers of delusion and paranoia, re-emerged. He embraced his old friend, a gesture of warmth and recognition that spoke volumes about the man he once was and the profound loneliness of his current existence. And then, as always, the moment passed, the clouds returned, the lucidity vanished, and he was once again adrift, leaving behind the silence of a mind lost to itself. These glimpses of humanity were not confined to interactions with old friends. There were also accounts of Charles showing concern for his family, particularly his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, and his children. During his periods of remission, Isabeau, despite the immense strain of his illness and the political machinations that often pitted her against various factions, remained a constant presence in his life. While their relationship was undoubtedly complex and fraught with difficulty, there were moments when Charles seemed to recognize her and express affection, a testament to the enduring bonds of their marriage, however strained. These moments, however brief, must have been both a comfort and a source of profound sorrow for Isabeau, a reminder of the husband she had lost to madness. Similarly, there were instances when Charles displayed an awareness of his own condition, a tragic self-consciousness that only added to his suffering. During these lucid intervals, he would reportedly express deep remorse for his behavior during his fits of madness, lamenting the chaos he caused and the burden he placed upon his kingdom. He would sometimes ask to be restrained, fearing his own unpredictable actions, a heartbreaking admission of his inability to control his own mind. These moments of self-awareness, while demonstrating a flicker of his former intelligence, also highlighted the immense psychological torment he endured, trapped in a cycle of lucidity and relapse, constantly confronted with the devastating reality of his own decline. His religious faith, a cornerstone of medieval life, also provided occasional moments of solace and connection. During his lucid periods, Charles would reportedly engage in prayer and religious observance with a fervor that suggested a deep spiritual yearning. He would attend Mass, listen to sermons, and seek comfort in the rituals of the Church. These moments of piety, while not curing his illness, may have offered him a temporary respite from his inner turmoil, a connection to a higher power in a world that had become increasingly incomprehensible to him. The chroniclers often noted these displays of devotion, seeing them as evidence that, despite his madness, the king's soul was not entirely lost. Even in his darkest moments, there were instances of unintentional, almost childlike behavior that hinted at the vulnerability beneath the terrifying exterior. One account describes how, during a period when he refused to eat, his attendants managed to coax him by pretending to be part of a game, a strategy that appealed to his regressed mental state. These small victories, while not indicative of a return to sanity, offered a glimpse into the complex and often contradictory nature of his illness, where moments of profound delusion could coexist with a childlike susceptibility to suggestion. These glimpses of humanity are crucial to understanding Charles VI, not merely as a mad king, but as a tragic human figure. They remind us that beneath the layers of illness, there was a person, a husband, a father, and a king who was grappling with a devastating and then incurable condition. They also highlight the immense challenges faced by those who cared for him, who had to navigate his unpredictable moods, endure his terrifying outbursts, and yet still find ways to connect with the person hidden within. The loyalty and compassion shown by some of his attendants, like the Duchess of Berry, who saved him from the fire, or the knight who returned to offer his friendship, stand as testaments to the enduring power of human connection, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. However, these moments of lucidity also served to underscore the tragedy of his situation. Each glimpse of the former Charles was a painful reminder of what had been lost, both for him personally and for the kingdom. They offered a stark contrast to the prevailing chaos of his reign, highlighting the profound impact of his illness on the governance of France. For the courtiers and family members who witnessed these fleeting returns to sanity, they must have been bittersweet, a mixture of hope and despair, a constant reminder of the king they had known and the one they now endured. In the grand narrative of Charles VI's reign, these glimpses of humanity are often overshadowed by the more dramatic accounts of his madness and its devastating consequences. Yet, they are essential to a complete understanding of his story. They reveal the complex interplay between illness and identity, the enduring power of human connection, and the profound tragedy of a mind unhinged. They remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, amidst the chaos of war and political intrigue, the human spirit, in all its fragility and resilience, continues to flicker, offering moments of light in an otherwise overwhelming darkness. Charles VI was not just a mad king. He was a man who, despite his profound suffering, occasionally found his way back, however briefly, to the shores of sanity, reminding us of the preciousness of the mind and the devastating consequences of its loss. As the years wore on, the once vibrant and charismatic Charles VI became an increasingly withdrawn and isolated figure, a prisoner within the confines of his own fractured mind. The fleeting glimpses of humanity, those precious moments of lucidity, grew rarer and more ephemeral, swallowed by the encroaching darkness of his persistent mental illness. His appearances in public were rare and meticulously managed, orchestrated by his court to maintain a semblance of royal authority and continuity, even as the reality of his incapacitation became an open secret across Europe. When he did speak, it was often a jumble of nonsense, disjointed phrases, or fragments of remembered prayers, a heartbreaking echo of the articulate and intelligent young king he had once been. The court, once a bustling hub of political intrigue and social life, transformed into a place of uneasy pageantry, where every gesture, every whispered conversation, masked the pervasive fear of what the king might do next, or what new delusion might seize him. The political landscape of France during these final decades of Charles VI's reign was a grim reflection of his internal turmoil. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War raged intermittently, tearing the country apart from within. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407, orchestrated by John the Fearless of Burgundy, marked a new, brutal chapter in the conflict, plunging France into even deeper cycles of violence and revenge. The English, under Henry V, capitalized on this internal strife with devastating effectiveness, culminating in the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This humiliating agreement, signed by a king barely aware of its implications, effectively disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, and designated Henry V as the regent and heir to the French throne. It was a testament to the profound weakness of the French monarchy, a direct consequence of Charles VI's prolonged illness and the resulting power vacuum. During these final years, Charles VI's daily life was a tragic routine of care and containment. He was attended by a dedicated, though often exasperated, group of servants and physicians who struggled to manage his unpredictable behavior. Accounts from the time describe him as often disheveled, his once fine clothes neglected, and his personal hygiene severely compromised during his periods of intense psychosis. He would sometimes refuse food, requiring careful coaxing or lash out violently at those who tried to help him. The glass delusion, the belief that he was made of glass and would shatter, persisted, making physical contact a constant challenge. He would often wander the palace halls, muttering to himself, or sit for hours in a catatonic state, staring blankly into space, lost in the depths of his own mind. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, often bore the brunt of his erratic behavior and the political fallout of his illness. While she was frequently criticized by chroniclers for her perceived extravagance and political maneuvering, she also faced the immense burden of caring for a mentally ill husband and navigating the treacherous waters of a fractured court. Her attempts to secure the regency and protect her children's interests were often seen as self-serving, but in reality, she was operating within a system where the king's incapacitation left little room for stable governance. The political factions frequently used her as a pawn or blamed her for the king's condition, further isolating her and adding to the tragedy of the royal family. The psychological toll on those around Charles must have been immense. His children grew up with a father who was both king and stranger, a figure of both reverence and fear. The Dauphin Charles, in particular, lived under the shadow of his father's madness and the constant threat of disinheritance. The court became a place of whispers and conspiracies, where loyalty was fluid and ambition reigned supreme. The atmosphere was one of constant tension, as everyone tried to anticipate the king's next mood swing or exploit his moments of weakness for their own gain. The once grand ceremonies and rituals of the French court continued, but they were hollowed out, devoid of the true authority and presence of the monarch. Despite the political turmoil and his personal suffering, Charles VI remained king until his death. This meant that all official documents, decrees, and treaties, including the Treaty of Troyes, had to be issued in his name, even if he was incapable of understanding or consenting to them. This legal fiction maintained a semblance of legitimacy for the various factions vying for power, but it also highlighted the profound tragedy of his reign. He was a king in name only, a puppet whose strings were pulled by ambitious relatives and foreign powers. His personal tragedy inextricably linked to the suffering of his nation. His final years were marked by increasing physical decline, exacerbated by his mental state. He died on October 21st, 1422, at the age of 53, after 4 decades on the throne. His death, while a release from his personal torment, did not immediately bring an end to France's woes. He left behind a nation fractured and weary, still bleeding from the wars and political betrayals that his absence had allowed to fester. The 100 Years' War continued, and the struggle for the French throne intensified, with both the English King Henry VI, son of Henry V, and Catherine of Valois, and the Dauphin Charles, who would become Charles VII, claiming legitimate succession. The legacy of Charles VI's madness was a deeply divided and vulnerable France, a nation that would require decades of struggle and the emergence of a new unifying figure, Joan of Arc, to finally reclaim its sovereignty and heal its wounds. His funeral was a somber affair, a stark contrast to the grand coronations and celebrations of his youth. The chroniclers noted the lack of genuine mourning, a reflection of how alienated the king had become from his people and his court. He was buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French monarchs. His reign a poignant reminder of the fragility of power and the devastating impact of mental illness on both an individual and an entire nation. The story of Charles VI's final years is a testament to the enduring human capacity for suffering, but also to the resilience of a nation that, despite being pushed to the brink, would eventually find a way to rebuild and reassert its identity. In retrospect, Charles VI's reign serves as a powerful historical case study on the intersection of mental health, leadership, and national destiny. His story underscores the profound responsibility that comes with absolute power and the catastrophic consequences when that power is wielded by a mind in disarray. The suffering he endured, both personal and political, left an indelible mark on French history, shaping its trajectory for generations to come. His final years were not just the end of a life, but the culmination of a tragic saga that began with the promise of a young king and ended with the quiet despair of a monarch lost to himself, leaving behind a kingdom in tatters. Charles VI's reign, a tragic saga spanning 4 decades, stands as a profound and multifaceted reminder of the inherent fragility of both leadership and the human mind. It is a historical narrative that transcends mere dates and events, offering a poignant case study on the devastating interplay between personal affliction and national destiny. A king once adored, hailed as Charles the Beloved, was transformed by a combination of trauma, genetic predisposition, and the immense pressures of his office into a figure of fear, pity, and ultimately a symbol of national disarray. His story warns us, with chilling clarity, of the dangers that inevitably arise when a single individual holds the fate of an entire nation, a concept particularly relevant in an age of absolute monarchy, and how mental illness, when misunderstood, stigmatized, and left unmanaged, can tear through the foundations of power like an uncontrolled fire through dry flax. One of the most striking lessons from Charles VI's reign is the critical importance of mental health, even and perhaps especially at the highest echelons of power in the medieval period, mental illness was largely attributed to supernatural causes, demonic possession, divine punishment for sin, or the malevolent influence of sorcery. There was little to no medical understanding of psychological disorders, and consequently, no effective treatments. Charles's suffering was compounded by this ignorance. Instead of receiving compassionate care and appropriate medical intervention, he was subjected to exorcisms, pilgrimages, and a host of ineffective remedies, all while his condition spiraled. This historical context highlights the immense progress humanity has made in understanding and treating mental health conditions, but also serves as a stark reminder of the enduring stigma that can still surround such illnesses even in modern times. His story compels us to consider how different the trajectory of France might have been had there been a contemporary understanding of conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and the resources to manage them effectively. Furthermore, Charles's reign underscores the inherent vulnerability of systems of governance that are overly reliant on the stability of a single individual. In a monarchy where the king was considered God's chosen representative on earth, his personal well-being was inextricably linked to the well-being of the state. When Charles became incapacitated, the entire edifice of French government began to crumble. The power vacuum he created was immediately filled by ambitious, self-serving relatives who plunged the nation into a devastating civil war. This internal conflict, fueled by the king's illness, directly invited foreign aggression, leading to the renewed and intensified English invasion during the 100 Years' War. The Treaty of Troyes, a humiliating agreement that effectively disinherited the French heir and handed the throne to the English, stands as a monumental testament to the catastrophic political consequences of a monarch's mental decline. It serves as a powerful historical argument for the necessity of robust institutional frameworks and clear lines of succession that can withstand the personal frailties of any single leader. Yet amidst the political and personal tragedy, there's also a glimmer of profound empathy in Charles's tale. He was not cruel by nature. Indeed, his early reign was marked by a genuine desire to govern justly and improve the lives of his subjects. He was the beloved for a reason. His mind betrayed him, not his character. The accounts of his moments of lucidity, when he would recognize old friends, express remorse for his actions, or simply weep in quiet despair, reveal a man trapped within his own affliction, mourning the loss of who he had once been. These glimpses of his former self, however fleeting, humanize him, transforming him from a mere historical figure into a deeply sympathetic character. They remind us that behind the grand titles and the weight of the crown, there was a human being experiencing immense suffering, a suffering that was largely incomprehensible to his contemporaries. His story also offers insights into the nature of trauma and its long-term psychological effects. The Bal des Ardents was not just an accident, it was a horrifying near-death experience that profoundly impacted Charles. While we cannot definitively diagnose him retrospectively, the immediate and dramatic deterioration of his mental state following this event suggests a strong link between severe psychological trauma and the onset or exacerbation of his illness. This aspect of his story resonates with modern understandings of post-traumatic stress and the complex ways in which the human mind can react to overwhelming stress and horror. It adds another layer of tragedy to his narrative, highlighting the external forces that contributed to his internal collapse. Moreover, Charles VI's reign serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and factionalism within a ruling elite. The Dukes of Orleans and Burgundy, instead of uniting to support their ailing king and stabilize the kingdom, exploited his weakness for their own gain. Their bitter rivalry, which escalated into open warfare, tore France apart from within, making it vulnerable to external enemies. This internal strife, directly enabled by the king's incapacitation, prolonged the suffering of the French people and nearly led to the complete subjugation of the nation. It underscores the importance of unity and responsible leadership, particularly in times of crisis, and the destructive consequences of prioritizing personal power over national interest. Finally, the enduring legacy of Charles VI's reign is a testament to the resilience of a nation. Despite the profound internal divisions, the devastating civil war, and the humiliating foreign occupation, France ultimately emerged from this period of crisis. The eventual triumph of Charles VII, aided by figures like Joan of Arc, and the expulsion of the English, demonstrated the underlying strength and identity of the French people. While Charles VI's madness brought France to its knees, it also, paradoxically, forced the nation to confront its vulnerabilities and ultimately forge a stronger, more unified identity in the crucible of adversity. His story, therefore, is not just one of tragedy and decline, but also one of eventual recovery and the enduring spirit of a nation. In conclusion, the reign of Charles VI is a complex tapestry woven with threads of personal suffering, political intrigue, and national trauma. It is a powerful historical lesson on the profound impact of mental illness, the fragility of absolute power, and the devastating consequences of internal division. Yet, it also offers a glimpse of human empathy and the enduring capacity for a nation to overcome even the most profound crises. His story remains a compelling and sobering reminder that even those at the pinnacle of power are ultimately human, susceptible to the same frailties and misfortunes that affect us all, and that the stability of a kingdom can sometimes hinge on the unpredictable currents of a single mind. Having journeyed through the tragic reign of Charles VI of France, a monarch whose mind succumbed to the relentless pressures of his crown, we now cross the English Channel, embarking on a new, yet eerily familiar, chapter in the history of mad monarchs. Our next stop is England, where we will encounter the Henry VI, a king whose destiny was inextricably linked to that of Charles VI, and whose own life would mirror many of the same heartbreaking struggles. Like Charles, Henry inherited his crown at an incredibly young age, bore the immense expectations of greatness, and slowly, tragically, succumbed to the debilitating pressures that came with wearing it. His tale is equally haunting, equally human, and serves as a powerful counterpoint to the French narrative. demonstrating that the burdens of kingship, coupled with the unpredictable nature of mental illness, knew no national boundaries. Henry Suck was born on December the 6th, 1421, in Windsor Castle, the only child of the formidable King Henry V of England and Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI of France. His birth was hailed as a moment of immense triumph and promise, for by the terms of the Treaty of Troy, signed just a year prior, this infant was destined to inherit not only the throne of England, but also, upon the death of his grandfather, Charles VI, the throne of France. Indeed, Henry VI, the victor of Agincourt, died in August 1422, when Henry VI was barely 9 months old. 2 months later, Charles VI of France also passed away. Thus, at less than a year old, Henry VI became the only English monarch ever to be crowned King of France, a dual monarchy that existed, at least in theory, for a brief, tumultuous period. This unprecedented inheritance placed an unimaginable weight on the shoulders of a child, a burden that would ultimately prove too heavy to bear. The early years of Henry's reign were, predictably, dominated by regency councils. In England, his uncles, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and John, Duke of Bedford, vied for control, while in France, the Duke of Bedford, a highly capable military commander and administrator, served as regent, attempting to consolidate English gains and enforce the terms of the Treaty of Troy. These regencies, while providing some stability, also exposed the young king to the constant machinations and rivalries of powerful nobles, a political environment that would undoubtedly shape his character and contribute to the pressures he would later face. Unlike his father, the warrior king Henry V, Henry VI grew into a man of profound piety, gentleness, and a deep aversion to conflict. He was more interested in scholarship and religious devotion than in the martial pursuits expected of a medieval king. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, institutions that stand as enduring testaments to his intellectual and spiritual inclinations. These qualities, while admirable in a private individual, were often seen as weaknesses in a monarch tasked with ruling 2 warring kingdoms. His personal rule began in 1437, and it quickly became apparent that Henry lacked the political acumen and decisive leadership required to navigate the treacherous waters of Anglo-French relations and the increasingly fractious English nobility. He was easily swayed by his advisors, often showing favoritism and a lack of judgment in his appointments. His gentle nature, which could have been a virtue, instead led to indecisiveness and an inability to control the powerful factions within his court. The ongoing war in France, which had initially seen English successes, began to turn against them. Joan of Arc's emergence had revitalized French morale, and by the 1440s, English territories in France were steadily being lost. Henry's desire for peace, while understandable, often led him to make concessions that were unpopular with his war-hungry nobility, further eroding his authority. The pressures mounted. The loss of French territories, particularly Normandy, which had been a cornerstone of English power on the continent, was a devastating blow to national pride and the royal treasury. The English nobility, many of whom had invested heavily in the French campaigns, grew increasingly discontent. This external pressure was compounded by internal strife. The court was divided between factions loyal to various powerful nobles, each vying for influence over the king. The queen, Margaret of Anjou, a strong-willed and politically astute woman, often stepped into the void left by Henry's indecisiveness, becoming a de facto leader, which further alienated many of the male nobility who resented her influence. Was against this backdrop of political and military decline that Henry VI, much like his French grandfather, began to exhibit signs of mental instability. His first major breakdown occurred in August 1453, a period of immense stress, following the final loss of Gascony, England's last significant territory in France, and the news of his wife's pregnancy. For over a year, Henry was completely unresponsive, unable to speak, recognize anyone, or even feed himself. He entered a catatonic state, a profound psychological withdrawal that rendered him utterly incapable of ruling. This period of incapacitation, strikingly similar to Charles VI episodes, plunged England into a crisis of succession and governance, mirroring the chaos that had engulfed France decades earlier. During this period of royal incapacity, the powerful Richard, Duke of York, a claimant to the throne through a different lineage, was appointed protector of the realm. This appointment further inflamed the already simmering tensions between the various noble factions, particularly between the House of Lancaster, Henry's lineage, and the House of York. When Henry unexpectedly recovered his senses in late 1454, he immediately reversed many of York's decisions, reinstating his favored advisors and demonstrating a clear, though perhaps misguided, will to rule. This sudden return to lucidity, followed by a reassertion of his authority, directly triggered the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that would devastate England for the next 3 decades. Henry's recovery, however, was not a return to full health. His mental state remained fragile, and he suffered subsequent relapses throughout his reign. These periods of illness, coupled with his inherent lack of political skill and his gentle, unwarlike nature, made him an ineffective leader in a turbulent age that demanded strength and decisiveness. He was often a pawn in the hands of his queen, Margaret, and her Lancastrian supporters, who fought fiercely to protect their son's inheritance against the Yorkist challenge. The image of Henry VI, a pious and gentle soul caught in the maelstrom of a brutal civil war, is one of the most poignant in English history. His reign was a continuous cycle of capture, release, and brief periods of restored authority, always overshadowed by his mental fragility and the relentless struggle for the throne. He was deposed multiple times, only to be briefly restored by Lancastrian victories. His final deposition came in 1471, after the Battle of Tewkesbury, where his son and heir, Edward of Westminster, was killed. Henry VI himself was imprisoned in the Tower of London and, shortly thereafter, died on May 21st, 1471, likely murdered on the orders of Edward IV, the victorious Yorkist king. His death marked the end of the Lancastrian line and a temporary end to the Wars of the Roses, though the scars of the conflict would linger for generations. In many ways, Henry VI's story is a direct echo of Charles VI's. Both were kings who inherited immense power and responsibility at a tender age. Both were afflicted by severe mental illness that rendered them incapable of effective rule. Both saw their kingdoms plunged into devastating civil wars and foreign invasions as a direct consequence of their incapacitation. The parallels are striking and serve to underscore a universal truth. The personal well being of a monarch, particularly in an age of absolute power, had profound and often catastrophic consequences for their entire nation. Their stories are not just about individual suffering, but about the systemic vulnerabilities inherent in monarchical systems when the central figure falters. However, there are also subtle differences. While Charles VI's madness was often characterized by terrifying delusions and violent outbursts, Henry VI's illness manifested more as a profound catatonia and withdrawal, a gentle unresponsiveness rather than aggressive paranoia. Both, however, shared the tragic fate of being unable to fulfill the demanding role of a medieval king, a role that required not just political acumen, but also physical and mental fortitude. Their stories serve as powerful reminders that even those born to the highest station are ultimately human, subject to the same frailties and misfortunes as anyone else. The reigns of Charles VI and Henry VI stand as two of the most compelling and tragic examples of how mental illness at the pinnacle of power can reshape the course of history. They are cautionary tales, not just about the dangers of an unstable mind, but about the profound impact of leadership on the destiny of nations. Their legacies are intertwined, two sides of the same coin, illustrating the devastating consequences when the crown becomes a burden too heavy for the mind to bear. Their stories, though centuries old, continue to resonate, offering timeless insights into the complexities of power, the fragility of the human psyche, and the enduring struggle for stability in a world often teetering on the brink of chaos. And with that, Night Owl, our journey through the troubled reigns of these mad monarchs comes to a close, leaving us with a deeper understanding of the human cost of power and the unpredictable nature of fate.